This is Fit to Succeed in partnership with NordicFitnessEducation.com with host Ben Pratt.
Good for you. I mean, some people naturally do not need as much sleep as other people. We even know this genetically about people, and yet we're still told you need to get 7.5 or 8 or whatever nonsense it is, because it's based on studies that are looking at potentially hundreds or thousands of people.
I am very privileged today to have a wonderful guest with me who had really hit the heights some years ago and seemed to me as if he went a little underground, but he hasn't. He's still around and he's still working hard. He is a practicing medical doctor. He's also an author of 9 books and as well as a known international speaker. He graduated from the University College London School of Medicine and holds a degree in Biomedical Sciences. He is a former columnist for a number of newspapers, the Daily Mail, the Observer, and Men's Health magazine. And he has also authored a book, which is the one that we're going to talk about a little bit today. It's called A Great Day at the Office. His name is Dr. John Briffa. Dr. Briffa, thank you for joining us on the Fit to Succeed show.
Thank you, Ben. You don't need to call me Dr. Briffa, but thank you very much.
That's all good.
Maybe my 6-year-old daughter, I might insist on that, but you could just call me John. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I appreciate it. It's really nice to have you with us today. Now, we first sort of got together and met each other perhaps almost a decade ago. I ran a small nutrition event, and Dr. Briffa was very gracious to join us and be a speaker. And as I understand now, John, you've gone into the world of corporate wellness, and I just wanted to start the conversation off by asking, you did start out as a medical doctor and now you've progressed into the field of corporate wellness. What was it that motivated you to make that significant shift?
Well, first of all, it didn't come out of nowhere, and then in a way it did come out of nowhere. So my background sort of medically was more in a sort of functional medicine approach, even though functional medicine didn't exist in those days, back in the sort of early 90s. So when I graduated in 1990, I became interested in essentially why people become unwell. Why is someone fatigued, or why do they have irritable bowel, or why have they got headaches or a skin problem? And so I started, essentially, I suppose, in nutritional medicine. It's really through an experience I had with a patient, oddly. Again, very serendipitous, unplanned, I would say. But it got me thinking about, well, why do people have health issues? And so I started essentially attempting to manage patients by helping them manage themselves, by understanding what was causing their problems. If they've got headaches, for example. I wasn't looking for a new pill or a different pill. I was looking for what's causing them. Often dehydration, by the way, Ben, as you probably know. But it could be something else, low magnesium or food sensitivity or misalignment of the bones in the neck or whatever. And then in the mid-90s, having been practicing for a while, an old school friend of mine had been just recently working with an organisation in the area of what was then called, and still is to a degree, sort of work-life balance. He was providing mainly a sort of a physical activity-related component into interventions that this organisation, who were very think ahead, were offering. And they were looking for someone to provide, if you like, a nutritional input. Maybe other areas, but principally nutrition. So I met with them and they sort of hired me, although I've always been essentially self-employed and had my own business. But anyway, they sort of hired me to work on these programs, which I thought were going to be awful in a way, on the basis that most of the people in the room were going to be accountants or finance professionals. And, my natural prejudices would be, that sounds a bit boring, but actually what I found was that the work was very rewarding in the sense that, I believe, I don't want to sound, too twee, but I believe there's value in the work that I do, but, it takes two to tango. And what I found was that these people generally were very receptive, partly because they perceived there was a need to look at these things, otherwise they wouldn't be attending the programs, for example, that we were running. But also because, a lot of people that work in organisations take a very sort of, what can I say, left-brained, logical, rational approach to facts and figures, if you like. So if you come at a subject from that proposition, I don't believe science is the be-all and end-all, Ben, but if you come at it from that proposition, you basically say, and so this study shows this, and that shows that, and whatever, then it's very easy, I found, to engage people in these organizations and have them have quite radical shifts in their thinking and, most importantly, their behaviors. But it all happened, it all started, if you like, rather by accident and serendipitously, which is a hallmark of my whole career, I would say. None of it was particularly, in case you're wondering, none of it was particularly well thought out. I sometimes get asked, how did that happen and what was your plan and whatever. I don't really have plans. I don't really believe in plans or even goals, quite frankly. I'm a great believer in sort of, moving from one thing that vaguely interests you to the next thing and just seeing how that goes. And then magically, mysteriously, sometimes quite unexpected opportunities arise, and then it's up to you to walk through the door once it presents itself. I mean, that's how my whole interest in this area happened. I was working in conventional medicine as a junior doctor in a hospital, and I met a patient who, just because I asked him the question, I wondered how he'd got to his age so well and fit and healthy. I just said, whatever you're on, I'd like some of, is the basic question that I asked him. And he went through a few ideas that sort of got me thinking. I read a book, I applied some strategies, but again, completely unplanned.
It's interesting that you say that, because we've had a few guests on the show just recently who have actually shared similar things where they were kind of just following their interests and their passions, and these great opportunities opened up that drove them into different fields within the industry that they were in. So it's interesting to hear you as a doctor say the same thing, that you went down this corporate route because of experiences and opportunities that opened your thoughts, and you just followed those interests. And that's fantastic.
That's it. And I'm a great believer in trusting your intuition and not trying to overthink things too much. You can get people in trouble. They chart some path to this goal that they feel will bring them some degree, I don't know, of happiness or satisfaction or peace or tranquility or whatever. Sorry, I don't want to get philosophical too early on. No, there is no future. There will never be a future. There's only now. So you better grasp, if you like, what opportunities are available to you in the moment. Like, what's interesting to me now? What excites me now? Not where do I want to be in 5 years, which is a question I keep getting asked, even at the age of 54, and I just think, I have no idea, and I don't care.
Well, I won't ask you that question then.
Okay.
What I would like to ask you, though, is let's delve a little bit more into this corporate wellness world, because I think it's an interesting field that seems to have, really built up some speed over the last couple of decades. And my first question is, and you may have some opinions and thoughts on this one, is what responsibility does an employer have towards the health and well-being of their employees in comparison to the actual responsibilities of the employee themselves? Because, I think you can look at it two ways. Surely the individual is also responsible for themselves. So maybe you could elucidate on that a little bit.
Yes, so I'm a great believer in people, should they wish to, by the way, because I don't believe everyone should be interested in health or well-being or performance or resilience. That's not for everyone. Some people are presumably happy not being interested in those things, and I'm very liberal in my approach, so I'm not an evangelist. I don't think everyone should subscribe to well-being. I don't believe that at all. I don't judge people who are overweight or smoke or eat KFC or whatever. I don't care what's in people's shopping trolley. I don't even look at it. It's none of my business, Ben.
Right.
So I'm liberal like that. Okay. So what I want to say is, for people who are interested and motivated to take charge of their health, mentally and physically, I'm a huge advocate of that, and I believe that comes down to individual choices and individual responsibilities. And I think that's really, for me, the nub of it. That's the key thing. Now, it is helpful if organizations, particularly large organizations, I think, have some degree of way of, if you like, facilitating that and supporting people's attempts to live and work successfully and sustainably, basically. But I don't think ultimately that the responsibility lies with the organization, it lies with the individual. Right. The other thing is, again, even when an organization is attempting to support their people, there's a number of ways, obviously, that they can do that. I don't think there should be an obligation by people in that organization to sign up to something. Because again, if that's not their thing and they're not that interested and they think they're doing fine on their own or whatever, that's up to them. So I think it is a marriage of these things. But if you were to say, right, we're going to ban one of these things, you know, we're going to ban people taking responsibility for their own well-being, or we're going to ban organisations providing support in that area, then I'd ban the organisations providing support, because actually without people taking personal responsibility, nothing really works anyway. You know, you're sort of pushing a bit of a boulder up a hill. So again, yeah, all right, there's some balance here, but I mean, overall, I think it's down to individual responsibility, but that is facilitated potentially by an organisation who's keen to help those people achieve their objectives.
Yeah, and I like that perspective. I like that you're using the words facilitate, support, those sorts of things. That makes quite a lot of sense. I guess there's another side to this, and that is even the question of, does an employer have the right to even interfere in someone's personal choices outside of their work environment in the first place? Because, you know, the individual is employed from, let's say it's 9 till 5 as a standard working day, and then outside of that, it's up to the individual how they choose to live their life. But yet we see this growing sort of interest in corporations seeking to encourage people to live good habits because they know their health, fitness, well-being, sleep habits, exercise, stress management all impacts their productivity in the working day. So, you know, is there something sort of self interest here with a corporation to try and maximize individuals' health that maybe is overstepping the boundaries?
Well, potentially. I've not seen it in the organisations that I work with. Normally, I think the intent is very good. They're attempting to provide information and sometimes even practical support in these areas, okay, which is great. There's sometimes a sort of straying into how you sort of live your life outside strict working hours, but it's not normally, in my experience, around lifestyle. As such, it's usually around sort of work practices. Right. I mean, a classic will be emails, where I think the French have even banned out of hours emails or something. But there are certain organisations that will say, right, no one's to send emails out of working hours. Now, even that, I fundamentally disagree with, because I believe, again, it's up to individuals to find the ways that work for them. Right. Now, for example, I'm just using this as an example. I don't work in a corporate, but I do a lot of my work early in the morning. And the reason that I do, which is particularly now, with my daughter being at home, once more or less she's up, then my options are very limited in terms of what I can do. Okay. Right. I mean, my wife is lovely and very supportive, but there's only so many hours in the day, and there's certain responsibilities that need to be taken care of. Okay. Sure. So a lot of my work goes on quite early on in the day, so it's not unusual for me to be sending emails at, I don't know, 5:30 in the morning. So outside strict working hours, right? Now, and if I was working for a corporate, that might be frowned upon by that organisation. Right. But I'm not telling people they have to read and act on that email. That's just a convenient time for me to send it. So why is it not okay for me to send it at that time, for someone to come to it at 9:30 in the morning and respond to it at 4 o'clock in the afternoon? This is, again, a sign of my rather liberal nature, and I generally encourage people to find what works for them. And it's helpful, I think, for organisations to be mindful of this and not try and corral people into certain behaviours that may suit someone and be very destructive for someone else, potentially. So I don't think it's the job, really, of organisations to tell people how to live their lives, okay, particularly outside work, including how they do their work outside strict working hours, or, for example, in the comfort of their own home, which has become a big thing recently. So I don't really believe in lines and, you know, everything neatly compartmentalised, but I would generally draw a line between what's going on, you know, around work, the workplace, working hours, and what people are doing in their lives. You know, yes. to what businesses are really interested in, ideally, is keeping people sort of productively employed and relatively healthy, you know, overall. How someone achieves that is really not the organisation's concern. If they can facilitate that person doing what works best for them, great. But beyond that, and End of story, I would say.
Yeah, nice. I like that. I think for me, my only real experience in corporate wellness was probably about 15 years ago. I was invited into London to to an organization to offer a day of a range of different things. And I can remember the day. It was clear that there was a number of people, probably about 20 in the group. There was a number of people who had been encouraged to be there, and they were not very engaged at the start. But interestingly, as the day progressed and we had a number of practical activities and did a range of things, I saw quite a few of those people become more and more engaged as they realized some of the things we were talking about could have benefit for them. Has that sort of thing been your experience as well?
Yeah, well, almost everything that I do with organizations is, from the sort of end user's perspective, is entirely voluntary. Mm-hmm. So we may run programs and people can sign up, but very, very rarely will someone feel in some way cajoled or somehow corralled to be there. Do you know what I mean? You're being singled out for special attention, now you need to go. And I've strongly resisted with clients any thoughts around making anything that I offer for that or involved in sort of mandatory in any way. Mm-hmm. Okay. But what you mentioned, this idea that people will get maybe gradually more engaged when they realize what relevance it has to them, not just in terms of their working lives, but also their lives outside work. Because it's all good and well being hopefully enthusiastic, energized, engaged at work and being productive and being resilient, for example. That's all fine. But most people, even if they like their work, Ben, like to have lives outside work as well. And mm-hmm. managing yourself in terms of your well-being, your energy, or your mental state is important for us to be able to have good experiences outside life. That, by the way, I've found is usually the hook. Mm-hmm. Right, so when let's say some people come into a room and I'm talking about, this is what this is about, this is why we're here. Of course, there's a business case, so it's unlikely that an organisation would be investing in the area without the business case, but people are sort of aware of that. Mm-hmm. But what they're really interested in is things that can help them sort of globally in their lives in general. Mm-hmm. And then once you're talking more on that level rather than, and here's another time management technique, then that's when people feel, if you like, more of an emotional connection to the content, if you like, and the way that you're putting it out there. And that's where you get, genuine, I think, mm-hmm. engagement and traction.
Nice. Now, if I, come from the health and fitness perspective, as this podcast is targeted primarily to fitness professionals, fitness enthusiasts. If we look at countries around Europe, we're looking between about 10 to 20% of the population on average are members of health clubs and gyms. When we look at sport, it's a little bit higher, maybe around 30% of people participate in sport. But then when we think about the corporate world and working, there's very much higher percentages of people employed and working. And so from that perspective, and thinking of our own need to manage the health of the population, do you think that all employers should have some kind of clear program or strategy to benefit the well-being and fitness and health of their employees?
Well, it depends a bit, I think, on the size of the organisation. So if you've got, a startup that's got 4 people in it, then you don't necessarily need something very formal. You might want to have some sort of culture. We've got some important work to do tomorrow, so as a group, we're not going to be drinking at midnight or, whatever. You can have quite informal, loosely held ideas that people are sort of signed up to. But when the organisation gets larger, then usually it's very helpful to have some sort of strategy. Okay, so usually organisations have strategies around things, like being successful in business. And one strategy can be around people, their human capital strategy. And a very important part of that will be the health and well-being of those people, because it really affects everything. It affects engagement, and it affects whether someone's able to work productively or not, or whether they're putting in the hours and being productive or not. What's called presenteeism, where people are putting in plenty of hours, they're just not really doing much. It's around mental well-being, isn't it? And it's potentially around the organisation being able to support all of this. Okay, with small organisations, very small, No, you don't really need a strategy. You just need to do things that are broadly helpful and maybe
Yeah.
that you buy into as a small group. Okay, that's relatively easy to do, but large organizations really benefit from having a strategy and having a clear idea of what they're, first of all, seeking to achieve with that, and also a very clear idea of what people actually want, which is sometimes missed.
Yeah.
So sometimes decisions about what people need and want are made by not the people who really need and want those things, but by people at a more senior level. Sometimes they're in touch, but sometimes they're not. I mean, one thing that's coming out in surveys is, when it comes to thinking about, managing work, life, and, well-being, there is a very significant need, because it's one of the things that sort of comes out that is generally wanted by people, particularly younger people. So there's an increasing need amongst younger people, millennials and younger, to be supported in this area. But what an organisation might think is, they need, I don't know, in on-demand counselling, or
Right.
I don't know, and employee assistance program, which isn't really what people generally want. What they want is to be able to learn information that is both science-based. Most people in corporates are quite sort of, they're a bit like those finance professionals I was talking about earlier. They're quite sort of left-brained.
Right.
So they like the scientific rigor, but then it has to be very practical. And it also has to be individualized, because, as you'll know, Ben, because you've worked with actual people, not everyone is the same, and different people need different things. Even something as simple as hydration. It can't be 8 glasses for everyone, can it?
Exactly.
If someone's twice the weight of me, do they need 8 glasses? If it's warm, or someone's active, do they need the same as when they're not? So people do need some structure around the information, but they also need it to be individualized. And that very often is not really part of what an organization tends to provide. It's usually let's just, often it's not particularly well thought out, and that's why sometimes the return, if you like, the traction that you get is not great, because it's not really matching the needs of the individuals.
I see. Now, as you kind of implied there's a need to individualize strategies, a need to support that process in corporates and in larger organizations. I wonder if we could begin to maybe unravel some of your thoughts and views around successful strategies, and let's pick up just a few topics one at a time. And the first one is, I want to draw from your book, A Great Day at the Office. And that is, in that book, you talk quite a bit about common problems in the workplace, in particular, sustained energy throughout the day. And you obviously talk about what many people will be more than familiar with is the mid-afternoon slump, as you start to get tired post-lunch. What could be the underlying cause of this common occurrence, and what can people do about it?
Well, sometimes people argue that there's a sort of a natural rhythm to the body's sort of arousal and energy, and that the sort of the mid-afternoon is a natural slump in energy. That might be true. But what I've actually found in practice is that what it's usually related to, and the major driving factor, is simply this: what is eaten at lunch? And let me just put it this way. If you are planning on sustaining good levels of energy through the day, most people are running on sugar effectively. They're running on carbohydrate in the system. Now, there are some people that have adapted very well to burning fat, and they're less reliant on sugar and blood sugar levels, but usually blood sugar levels are involved when someone's getting tired and maybe sleepy in the afternoon. So the typical pattern is they eat something at lunch that causes quite a lot of sugar in the system relatively quickly, and as you all know, insulin is secreted, and then that's fine because it sort of takes sugar out of the bloodstream and puts it in the cells, which is the real point of it. But also that can cause the system to overshoot a bit, leading to low blood sugar, usually an hour to maybe 3 hours later, for example. And that I've found overall to be the most common reason why people sort of end up not being particularly energized or focused or productive through the afternoon.
Okay.
So what are the problem foods? Well, loads of the starchy foods are actually quite disruptive to blood sugar. So you're familiar with probably the glycemic index, this quantification of the speed and extent to which a food releases sugar into the bloodstream. Now, this will vary a bit from person to person, time to time, what they eat with it, how quickly they eat it, whether it's cooked or cold or whatever it is. Sure. There's a number of factors that are going to influence that. But broadly speaking, bread, for example, has quite a high glycemic index. So, French bread is about the same as glucose. Even brown bread, it's still very high. It's about the same as table sugar. So when someone basically, if I can just get to the nub of it, but I'm trying to explain the theory behind it. When someone eats a sandwich-based lunch, or a foot-long baguette or something quite carby, quite a big bowl of pasta or whatever, then there is a reasonable risk, quite a high risk, I would say, that they're going to get a surge of sugar, then a lower blood sugar later on that's going to sort of drain the life out of them. And usually what works better, Ben, is to eat something that is a bit less carby.
Yep.
So what is that? It's usually some form of protein stroke fat with some vegetable matter around it. So that could be, I don't know, salad from Pret, chicken salad from Pret. It could be a piece of meat or fish with vegetables or whatever. But it's essentially a bit more paleo, isn't it? It's a bit lower carb than what they would be eating normally. And that normally, in my experience, I don't know, 8 times out of 10 solves the issue.
Right. I like that you've quantified that it doesn't solve the issue all the time, but a lot of the time it does. And I think perhaps for many of our listeners, they'll be quite familiar with that concept of the spikes and the drops, and this idea of maybe addressing that over a lunchtime. However, I suppose for many people, I guess their habits quite often at lunchtime are driven by what's available, because a lot of people don't prep any food or bring something with them. They just go, well, that's the convenient place for me to grab a sandwich. And so how have you managed those kind of concerns when they're raised to say, well, where am I going to get that? There's nowhere near.
Well, I'll tell you how I've managed it, Ben, by not living in the 1970s anymore. But when people look, you walk into most of the, the regular chains and even the smaller independent ones, long gone are the days really where these places only really offer sandwiches or something very carb-based.
Right.
All of them, doesn't matter whether it's Pret or Eat or Leon or whatever, offer some really good options there. Once you're aware of what a good option actually is, and you don't default to, oh, well, I normally eat a BLT. Now, by the way, I don't mind what people do, okay? I'm not judging people that eat BLTs, but the reality is that sometimes people are stuck in a bit of a lane when they walk into these places, because it's what they've done for the last 5 years or whatever. But when they sort of, pan out a little bit, they realize that, about a quarter of what you can get in these places is generally a good option if you're wanting to eat vaguely healthily and planning on having a productive afternoon.
Yeah.
It used to be different, because very often in sandwich shops years ago, as I was alluding to earlier, there weren't that many options, and now there's tons of options, tons of options everywhere you go. It's just a matter of people being more aware of them. One of the other things that sort of trips people up is just having a bit too much choice as well. And so I encourage people around, say, their work locale, when people used to go to work, all right, and we'll probably do in the future, but go into 2 or 3 places, work out sort of what works for you and you like. And then when you walk in, instead of having that anxiety of looking up at a board or down at all these things and having, pretty much before you walk in what you're going to get.
Right.
That makes everything a lot easier, basically. But you first of all have to do a bit of a fact-finding mission and just start looking around and go, oh, that would work and this would, and that, This is why I sometimes believe it's very important to have some very simple principles in your mind and not be thinking about calories and fat grams or carb content or glycemic indices. So if you have basically a sort of a paleo ideal in your head, is that broadly meat, fish, egg, and vegetables, and avocado or whatever, or not?
Yeah, I'm with you.
Because if it is, it's likely to be fine. And if it's bread-based, it's likely to be not. Simple as that. Now it's relatively easy to go that, not this.
Yeah, and I think a way a lot of people have traditionally managed that whole process is when they get the slump, that's when they reach for their coffee to try and mask the
Well, it's not the
symptoms.
coffee, unless there's sugar in it, it's chocolate.
Or a chocolate, yeah, good point.
It's usually chocolate, because often, when blood sugar levels get low, it's natural for the body to crave something that replenishes sugar quite quickly. You can get a bit of a jolt from coffee, undoubtedly, depending on how sensitive to caffeine you are and how much caffeine there is in there. But usually what people reach for is chocolate.
Yeah, it's the sneaky chocolate in the office drawer, isn't it? Absolutely.
It's Twix o'clock or whatever they call it.
Now, there is another side to this, which is for some people, it may not always be the food intake, and that sleep itself is a big factor in whether somebody starts to feel fatigued during the day. Now, obviously, sleep can have a range of impacts upon us. Maybe you could just discuss for us how poor sleep or faulty sleep habits might lead to low productivity, regardless of what's happening with food intake.
Yeah, well, it's critical. So it has a sort of short-term influence very often. So, you know, there's two main forms of sleep. There's sort of deep sleep that you tend to get initially when you get to sleep, and then as the night goes on, you get more shallow sleep. The shallowest of which is called REM sleep. REM sleep is predominantly where the brain is actually quite active. There's often sleep going on. Dreaming going on. And it seems to be mainly important for certain mental factors. And so when we're cutting sleep short, usually what we're predominantly missing out on is REM sleep. And the implications they're not exclusively for the brain, because we know short sleep can cause all sorts of metabolic issues. But they are, in the short term, mainly brain-related issues. So it could be slowed mental performance, or it could be more errors being made, or it could be feeling you have to put more effort into doing things, which makes things harder and less sustainable. It could be mood-related issues. It makes people, by the way, less what's called pro-social. What's pro-social? Well, about other people. Like what? Well, having empathy or being generous, for example. That happens less when people are sleep deprived, for example. The other thing that I've found long-term, it's usually at the centre of someone's unsustainability. If you ask someone, are you going to be able to be doing this in 2 years' time, however they're living their life, and they go, no, then you know that there's unsustainability there. And when you start to look at, well, what's causing this to be unsustainable, obviously it can relate to things like workload and stresses and whatever. But usually, in terms of lifestyle, the thing that's key and central to this will be someone's sleep. And once that is optimized, usually the unsustainability turns into something way more sustainable. Potentially completely sustainable. So there's both short and long-term implications, really. Now, you know, fortunately, I think sleep has moved up the agenda a little bit in recent years. What I still think is going on is some quite poor advice around sleep.
Yeah, I'd love to get into that.
Well, one thing will be this idea that we should be getting 7.5 or 8 hours or whatever, which is, well, it's like saying everyone should be drinking 8 glasses of water each day.
It's too basic.
Well, it's the same for everyone, and it can't vary a bit from time to time. I mean, if you have a bad couple of weeks of sleep, Ben, your need for sleep is more at the end of that than it was at the beginning, right?
For sure, yes.
Mind you, if you catch up on sleep, if you can never do that with 5 kids, but anyway, if you catch up on sleep, okay, then your need for sleep will be a bit less at the end of, say, a holiday or whatever. And so I think a lot of people get sort of, fixated on I need to get 8 hours, but actually needs vary from person to person and from time to time. And so I'm much more symptom-based in my approach. So how much sleep do you actually think you need? So most people have an intuitive sense for this, Ben, and they'll say, as long as I get 7 hours, I'm golden. Okay, fine. How many hours do you actually get? And they go, well, on average 6. Well, there's your problem. Right, yeah. Are you waking to an alarm? Because if you are regularly waking to an alarm, you're almost certainly not getting optimal amounts of sleep. Otherwise, you wouldn't wake to an alarm.
Yeah, you'd wake on your own.
How do you feel when you wake up? Is it that's time again? Oh dear. Or is it great? Let's get going. Do you use the snooze function on your phone? Because if you do, that's probably not a good sign. Are you, for example, catching up on sleep? Which, by the way, is a good thing. Because they say you can't, but I can tell you can. That's another myth, I think, around sleep. So if you're catching up on sleep, great that you're doing that, but what's it a sign of? Probably not getting optimal amounts of sleep at other times, otherwise you wouldn't be catching up, Ben. Do you see?
Yeah.
So once you've answered a few of those questions, if there's, that just sounds like me, well, you've got a problem. Forget the 8 hours, whatever. You're not getting enough sleep to meet your needs. A bit more or improving the quality of your sleep would be helpful. If you're not answering these, I don't care. You could be getting 6 hours sleep. If you don't have these symptoms, okay, go for it.
All right, I'm with you.
Good for you. I mean, some people naturally do not need as much sleep as other people. We even know this genetically about people, and yet we're still told you need to get 7.5 or 8 or whatever nonsense it is, because it's based on studies that are looking at potentially hundreds or thousands of people. Exactly. And we're not hundreds of thousands of people, we're just us, Ben. So that's one myth, okay, that we all need the same amount of sleep. Another myth, I think, is that sleep should be scheduled. So the idea, I'm sure you're familiar, is that we should go to bed at 10 and get up at 6, say, and do that every night, including not just the week, but into the weekend. So we're habituated to this very regular cycle. I understand the logic of that, Ben, but outside COVID-19, number one, who can do it? Because if you sign up to that, you've got no life. You can't socialise, you can't really go. Honestly, it's very, very difficult. So it creates a sort of tension. I should be going to bed at 10, and now my wife is talking to me, and it's 10:15.
I'm stressing.
Or no, I can't go to that dinner because it's likely to end up, after 11. I can't go for drinks with my team or whatever. All sorts of tensions arise. And then the other thing about it is that most people outside COVID-19, I think it's slightly better for some people in the situation because they're out less and they're able to go to bed a bit earlier. But in the normal course of events, most people are in a degree of sleep debt. Hardly anyone in the corporates, for example, is getting optimal amounts of sleep. So I'd make a strong case for catching up when you can. So sleep in a bit if you can, but mainly go to bed a bit early when you can. Not every night, just when you can, just to, recoup some of the loss, which seems to work very well. Now, if you're sticking to a schedule, Ben, you can't catch up. You can't go to bed earlier. You can't sleep in when you have the occasion to do that because you're sticking to your ridiculous schedule. And that's I think it's actually counterproductive for most people to try and stick to a schedule for these reasons. So that's why I don't tell people to try and stick to a regular schedule, because usually it's more trouble than it's worth. It's counterproductive rather than helpful. See, it's another myth. It's all good in theory, lovely theory. I get the theory. It's like the calorie principle, lovely theory. It's not very helpful on the ground when you actually work with people. So anyway, it's not just a quantity of sleep, by the way, that's important. It's also quality, and there's a few things that can be helpful there.
Yeah, for sure. Obviously, people could be actually in bed sleeping for 8 hours, but the sleep quality they get is poor, and then they still feel shattered the next day. So, that's perhaps a discussion for another day, to be honest.
Yeah, maybe.
There's probably lots to unravel within that very discussion. There is one other thing.
Yeah, we could do a deep dive on sleep easily. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. It's a fascinating subject, something that I enjoy getting into. Now, I wanted to talk about one more thing, particularly in relation to corporate wellness, and this is something I do believe all employers have a responsibility for, and that is to help their employees to manage their stress load. Because obviously within a work environment, every business wants to be as productive as possible, and so therefore they set employers' tasks or employees' tasks, and they usually put deadlines to try and maximize how quickly work gets done. And that often leads into work bleeding over into people's personal lives. And we get this higher and higher stress load. And so how does excessive stress actually have the opposite effect if employers push too hard? How does it lead to poor performance?
Well, first of all, it's a very good question. Secondly, I think you're right about the nub of the issue here. So stresses come in lots of different forms, but the number one thing that comes up time and again, whether I'm coaching someone individually, speaking to a group, running a workshop, whatever, is workload. But it is not really the workload, it's what you're saying, it's workload coupled with deadlines. If someone says, here's a load of work, take your time, turn it in sometime, we don't mind when.
No bother.
Well, there's no stress, is there? Yeah. But actually it's a lot of work that doesn't seem to fit into the time that's allowed for it in terms of the working schedule. And now, as you're saying, it's bleeding into the evenings, the second shift, people coming home, eating, putting their kids to bed, eating, and then doing a second shift, or it's bleeding into the weekend or on holiday or whatever. By the way, what you described is exactly how it is for a lot of people, okay? So let me just talk, I suppose, a little bit about stress. There's a couple of things. There's a short-term implication for stress. So the way that it affects the brain principally is important here. So of course it affects our physiology, maybe heart rate and blood pressure go up slightly. But one effect of stress, particularly when there's a feeling of lack of safety, threat, that sort of thing, it tends to trigger a part of the brain called the amygdala. The amygdala is, a really ancient part of the brain. It's part of the limbic or emotional system in the brain. And what it's good for is essentially short-term survival. Walk through a jungle, see a tiger, you want your amygdala firing, but by the same token, walk into the street, see a car closer than you thought it was, or that you didn't see in the first place. You need your amygdala firing, right? So it's very reactive, and it's good for survival. It's just not very helpful day to day. Because if you want to focus on a task, be clear about your objectives, do good work, and you want to be also at the same time good around some things like your rational mind, making good decisions, being effective at doing whatever you're doing, having good what's called working memory, all this sort of stuff, you need your prefrontal cortex engaged, basically. That's the part of the brain, you know, as its name sounds, at the front of the brain, and it's essentially more rational and thinking. It's not really reactive, it's more responsive to what's going on. The problem is when you have stress going on and you're triggering essentially this emotional limbic amygdala system, then it takes the prefrontal cortex offline. And that makes it very difficult for you to pay attention, to focus on things, to prioritize, think clearly, make good decisions, solve problems, you see. So in the short term, it scrambles people's heads, basically. And that is not helpful. So too much stress has that sort of acute effect. So it makes people less productive and less happy, of course, less fulfilled. Okay, that's one thing. And then over the long term, stress has other implications. So it can lead to all sorts of, you know, health-related issues. The end consequence of which may be something that resembles burnout, which I'm sure you're familiar with as a term. What is burnout? Well, the other sort of component in a stress response, other than our nervous system, and what's called the sympathetic nervous system that drives, for example, may interconnect with the amygdala or whatever, is our hormonal response to stress that comes through something called the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And over some time, usually, it's not usually acute stress, it's long-term stress, that system can sort of weaken, and what you end up with is what we say in the form of medicine that I practice would call adrenal fatigue. So the HPA axis sort of weakens. Now this leads to problems around energy, and if it really sort of gets bent out of shape, it is, as I alluded to earlier, what really causes burnout.
We're talking about
So,
resiliency against stress there. That's what you're getting to, the ability to...
Yes, because if you have, well, first of all, there's psychological ways of being sort of resilient, but sort of physiologically, if you're in quite good shape and you have a good HPA axis, then the load that you can bear before things start to become a problem is much bigger. You have much more sort of reserve tank. You are more resilient. If this system is already weak, and this is why sometimes what seems like a relatively insignificant event can sort of drop people off a cliff a bit. So they've had lots of stress for lots of years, and then something comes along like a extended project or a difficult emotional issue, and it seems that that's the trigger point for their burnout, but actually it's been brewing for years, possibly a couple of decades, do you see? Now, once people understand this and they can get to grips with this, and even if it wasn't true, I do believe it is true, by the way, having dealt with, I mean, hundreds of people in burnout, but even if it isn't true, it gives people a sort of model or a way of thinking about stress, so they go, oh, that's why I feel like this, or that's why I behave like this. Because one of the other things stress does, by basically taking the prefrontal cortex offline, is not cause people not just to be not very productive, it can sort of drive some bad behavior.
Yes, some reactive sort of
rational,
very
yes,
quick,
reactive, you know, and not just at work. In fact, at work, often because of the so-called corporate mask, people are reasonably all right, and then they get home, and then their 6-year-old daughter gets it. Why? Exactly. Because there's glitter on the carpet, or whatever. And so this can really affect people. So this, I think, short and long. I've tried to simplify it a bit because stress is a huge subject. You can spend hours talking about it. But there's a sort of short-term implication that I think is more about the brain, and then a longer-term implication around the physiology. And this is why it's not helpful to basically have this message, which is gone now. It's not the 80s anymore. That essentially the more hours you put in, the more productive you are. That's true to a point, but it's unsustainable for most individuals. And usually the sweet spot will come out for most people at around 40 or 50 hours a week, something of that order. But that will also depend really on how resilient they are, what they're doing to support themselves, whether they actually like their work or not, whether they have toxic relationships with their colleagues or not. I mean, there's a whole, whether they're living their life's purpose, a million different things can come into this. But broadly, it's not the more hours someone puts in, the more effective they are.
Yeah.
It doesn't work that way.
You often see when people speak to each other in corporate environments that busyness is almost flagged as a badge of honor. Hey, how are you doing? Oh, I'm so busy. And that seems to be a very common response.
Yeah, the people that I'm most attracted, I mean, I've met thousands of these people now, but the people that interest, I mean, obviously I'm trying to help anyone, okay? So it's like, when doctors say, oh, I saw an interesting case, I'm like, was it interesting for them? Because really what you're there to do is trying to solve their problems for them. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So when they say, oh, it's interesting, and it's a very rare case, and, well, could you do anything? But no, but in the book it says that, I'm like, well, this is just an intellectual exercise, and I'm not that sort of person, by the way. But the people that I'm most sort of drawn to, in a way, in the corporate environment, are people who, although they may be very good, very talented, very valuable to a business and doing their life's work, they're very sort of calm, is how I would describe them. They really have no need to push or exert themselves. They're sort of, in a way, they're sort of going with the flow. They're very good, by the way, those people, at identifying what's really important.
Right.
They're not intent on being busy, they're just intent on being effective. So they're very good at prioritizing, these people. So they try and kind of, whether they do this naturally or not, I don't know, but they get all the crap out of their heads, basically. And then they have a laser-like focus on what's important here. And those are the kind of most effective, productive people. There's not that much going on for them, oddly, but they're very good at really focusing on what's important.
Yeah.
That's what really determines, really, in my view, whether someone is super. When I say successful, I don't mean financially, materially successful. I mean successful by their definition, which would be something like this: having a good, rewarding, fulfilling life.
I'm with you.
Yeah, in a broader sense.
So I think what you're sort of getting at is that people often allow life to react, and they have to spend a huge amount of their time in their working life constantly responding to reaction and putting out fires. But you're saying the ones who tend to be the ones who manage their stress the most, the ones who can say, these things matter, these things are lower down the order, so I'm going to move them out of my field so I don't have to react all the time, and I can focus on the things.
That's right, yeah.
Move the needle.
But this also relates to something else about how people manage stress, because I think a lot of people believe stress is the result of things that happen to them.
Yes, from outside.
In a way, that is true. Okay. Yes, it's I don't know, the crashing global economy, or I'm having to furlough some of my people, or I'm not glib about any of these things, by the way. But it's workload, it's stresses around relationships, it's kids that don't do what you tell them to do, whatever it is, But a lot of people who are at peace, basically, are very good at not just focusing on what's important, they're also good at focusing on the things that they can actually do something about, what they can control, not what they can't. And most stresses appear to come from things that are external to us, but actually that isn't the cause of the stress. This is why two people could have a completely different response to the same thing. Okay? This is why, for example, in the days that we used to go out more, I could get very irritated about what I see as sloppy service in a restaurant, and my wife doesn't give a monkeys. She doesn't even see it.
Right.
But what's the difference? It's the same experience. We just have very different perspectives.
Right.
Do you see? I'm creating the stress because of my perspective, right? And so these people, very often that I'm talking about, some of the most productive, and I mean successful in a very holistic way, people do not divert their attention to things they can essentially do nothing about. One example of this is that they very often have a very sort of, they're quite uncontrolling, because they realize that they can't really control other things, their partners or whatever, so they're quite sort of, they don't focus on that, they're really focused on the inner game. They talk about golf being played in the 6 inches between your temples, basically. Yeah. Life is exactly the same, in my view, and these people very often have mastered that. Okay, they have mastered the art of living their lives in a way where they focus their attention on the most important things, and principally the things that they are in control of, which is essentially their perspectives on things, not this sort of external fickle, threatening thing that appears to be going on out there. It's all really a question of perception. You could argue there's no reality as such. It's just our perspectives on things. What's a belief? You may have a very strongly held belief. We're getting a little bit psychological stroke philosophical here, but a belief is just simply something you keep thinking. And someone else is entitled to a completely different belief, right? And they're both as real, but they are just that. They're just thoughts that are, going round and round. But sometimes it's useful for people to step back a bit and understand this. Because when they think life is being a bit difficult or unfair, and they're feeling stressed about that, and this is not to judge them, okay? It's to say, well, what am I believing about this that's causing me to have this reaction? Because once you get to that, then you're in a position to exert a bit of what's called cognitive reappraisal, or could you come at this from a different angle, and therefore have a completely different emotional response and outcome, by the way.
And I guess that's what happens often when you go and you present information and you help people see things from a different perspective in your corporate work, that you probably have a few people who have these eureka moments every now and again where they suddenly see a different perspective they hadn't before seen, and then that alters their belief, which then may alter their future behavior. Would that be true?
Yes. Well, I don't want to sound too self-ingratiating, but in a way it's all about that.
Exactly.
I mean, sometimes it's about just giving someone a framework that they're possibly using already, or a habit that they're possibly using already, that just, if you like, redoubles their commitment to it, because they go, oh, I found that works, and now I sort of realize a bit better why that works, and now they're even more committed to it in a way. Excellent. But for some people, many people actually, it's like, oh, I had no idea. Now they understand some basic principle, they understand its relevance to them. And for many people, essentially what you're doing is you're revealing something to them that makes their lives easier than better. Of course, to change your thinking or your behaviors, you have to put some effort in. You'll know that, given your industry, right? You get sort of nothing for nothing, is that the expression? But you know what I mean? You have to put a bit of effort in. But what you're trying to do is present something that is so simple to do, or easy to do generally, and sustainable, that although it takes some effort, some investment, if you like, the return on it is so huge. Why would you not do it? It's a bit like if I said to you, Ben, give me £1 and I'll give you £5. And you said, any catch? No catch. That's just how it works. Then why wouldn't you do it? You have to get people more, in a way, to glimpse that. So not only do they have that eureka moment, but essentially they're immediately thinking, why wouldn't I do it that way then?
The benefit outweighs the risk by a long way.
It's so obvious. I wish I'd known 20 years ago is often the response, but anyway.
Exactly. It's been really fascinating talking to you, and I think it would be great just to finish off with a couple of quick fire questions with you. And my encouragement here would be to, how succinctly can we respond? Now, obviously, some of these we could go into for hours.
So stop going on, John. Is that what you're saying?
No. I just want...
Stop going on. Okay, bye, okay.
I want to use this to our benefit, a quick few questions.
Go for it.
First one, so 30 seconds. How does morning sunlight exposure potentially help with daily well-being?
So one of the things that sunlight does is essentially energize the brain, makes us more alert, improves mental performance generally. It also can increase something called serotonin in the brain, which is mood enhancing. By the way, at the end of the day, serotonin is converted into melatonin, our sleep hormone. So it has implications during the day in terms of our mood and mental function, but also subsequently at the end of the day, it promotes good sleep to get good light exposure during the day, although we need to control light exposure in the evenings generally to optimize sleep. That's another topic maybe for another day. But basically, it helps mood and mental function and then promotes sleep, which is important for mood and mental function.
Brilliant.
And it's free, generally, so it's helpful.
Brilliant. Next. What are your thoughts with regards to using breathing exercises as a possible short-term stress solution?
It's a very good idea. So there are studies that show, I don't think I go into this too much in the book, but there are studies that show basically that breathing, well, first of all, when you control your breathing, it seems it's all command and control, Ben, that you're basically telling your respiratory system to slow down or breathe from the diaphragm. But there's information going back the other way. So when you tell the respiratory system to calm down effectively, the respiratory system basically tells your brain to calm down, essentially at the same time. There's a sort of feedback loop. So you can basically affect your brain very directly by essentially controlling your breathing. There's a study that shows that, for example, breathing techniques can reduce activity in the amygdala and increase activity in the prefrontal cortex.
Oh, really? Wow.
Or we know, for example, that breathing exercises can stimulate activity in the vagus nerve, part of the parasympathetic nervous system, that basically balances the sympathetic nervous system and calms things down. So as a short-term stress relief, fantastic. Great. So what could you do? Well, you could slow your breathing down, extend the out breath, breathe into the abdomen, in and out through the nose generally is helpful. There's something called box breathing that people can look up. You breathe in, hold, breathe out, hold for the same length of time each time. Made popular and famous by the US Navy SEALs, who apparently do that. I don't know if it's true, but that's what's said.
Fantastic.
So good for inducing a sort of a calm, alert state. So there's lots of things that can be done, lots of different techniques. But it's a distinct tick, a yes to breathing for managing short-term stress or even long-term stress.
Thank you. There's a tip right for people to use today. Okay, next is, can the use of appropriate music in the workplace be beneficial for productivity? Because I've seen offices where it's just deadly silent and people are all working in their cubicles. Could music be beneficial for productivity?
Yes. Well, first of all, workplaces generally are very distracting and hardly anyone goes to work to do proper work. You ask anyone where they go to do really sort of deep work where you need, I don't know, 2 or 3 hours to really think about something. Imagine you were preparing a presentation, Ben. Mm-hmm. Imagine doing that in an office with people chatting here and the odd meeting there and phones going and whatever. Forget it. So people generally need to be undistracted, and one way to do that, first of all, is to do what I'm doing now, which is to wear noise-cancelling headphones, okay, which is generally helpful. But also music can be helpful on top of that, I would say, even at home. But it really depends on the nature of the music and that individual, okay? So what you want, generally, is something that provides a sort of oral wallpaper, essentially, but doesn't distract you. So sometimes, if it's a bit too lyrical, right? Yeah, there's words coming out, basically. It's not helpful. Maybe what you want is something more musical. Maybe for some people it might be classical music. Some people it might be a bit more techno or whatever. But it needs to basically provide an oral wallpaper that is not distracting. So it's blocking out a lot of noise, basically. There are certain technologies that can actually help mental concentration. There's something called binaural beats, and there are certain apps that provide sounds and soundscapes that use this technology to help focus or sleep or whatever. But basically, you have to find what works. Same with things like mindfulness and meditation. You have to find what works for you. And most people have an intuitive sense. So I can tell from my own experience, by the way, that if I'm working in a public place, if I use noise-cancelling headphones and I play music, it doubles my productivity compared to just being sat there with all sorts of things coming into my head. Yeah.
So I think in the fitness profession,
very useful.
I think in the fitness profession, it's almost the opposite, because most gyms, the music is loud and invasive. And at the end of a shift, if you've been in the gym for 8 hours, it's almost a complete relief to leave that environment to be able to have some quiet. So I imagine many fitness professionals are familiar with that, where music has the opposite effect because it is so invasive.
Why can't you allow people to choose to have the music or not? Do you mean, if I owned gyms, okay, I would ban music, I think, and I'd say, if you want to listen to music, then get your phone and like people do,
connect to our system,
listen to whatever you want, okay? Because there are some people that might want to do it in total quiet, but also you're now battling with headphones. You're now having to turn them up quite loud to drown out what's coming in from outside. I mean, I know it's normally what's done, but if it was me, I'd ban it. You know, I would like my gymnasium, if I had one, to be like a museum or a library.
You remind me of a couple I used to see would come into the gym. They were probably in their 70s, retired, and they would literally spend their whole workout with ear defenders on so that they could work out in silence. Thought that was a great message.
Oh, how about some earplugs?
Yeah.
Just some earplugs would be helpful. Yeah.
Well, it's been really great.
Any more questions?
No, that's great.
Okay.
It's been great chatting with you today, John. I appreciate your time and your expertise, and particularly letting us have a deep dive into the world of corporate wellness. And I hope for the listeners that they've gained some insights. And if you're not already considering any work in this particular field, maybe there's something you could do to benefit corporations and employers in the area that you live. Dr. Briffa, any final words before we come to a close?
No, thank you very much for having me, Ben. It's a pleasure speaking with you and reconnecting with you again after about a decade of not being in touch. So thank you very much.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and share via social media. You can also rate the show on iTunes, Stitcher, or YouTube. If you'd like to know more about us, then check out our range of online courses at www.nordicfitnesseducation.com.